So now that we've explored the question of whether or not we are actually dreaming, or whether or not we can even tell whether or not we're dreaming, what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to move on and look at the second question that was proposed, which is, can I be immoral when I'm dreaming? And this really ties into the ethics of dreaming, and we're going to start by looking at really the first person to come up with some kind of formalization of this, who was St. Augustine. So specifically, we're going to move away from the metaphysics of dreaming and go into the ethics of dreaming. Okay, look at one of the oldest views within the ethics of dreaming, the work of St. Augustine of Hippo. So when it comes to the ethics of dreaming, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to work out? Because there are some quite interesting ethical questions when it comes to dreaming. Can I be immoral within dreams? This is one of the main questions within the ethics of dreaming. Like, if I dream that I murder somebody, does that make me a bad person? Things of that nature. Exactly, which is what I put there. Right. Essentially, if you do anything that you consider to be immoral in your dreams, do you have any kind of guilt, or should you have any guilt, or hold any kind of responsibility for those dreams when you are then awake? So let's assume that we can actually distinguish between being in a dream and being awake for a second. Let's just assume that Descartes was wrong. When I'm in a dream, if I do something immoral, if I dream something immoral, should I have any kind of ethical responsibility for those dreams, for those actions within the dreams? So this really hinges on the questions that are based on the work of St. Augustine. So Augustine of Hippo was a theologian between the years 354 and 480 AD. So a very, very early church father, very early church thinker. And effectively his writings are some of the most important within the doctrine of Western Christianity. And he developed a number of theological principles that are still recognized within Christianity today. He's one of the most important key thinkers of Western thought, regardless of what you think about religion and Christianity. His thinking shaped a lot of Western culture today. He also wrote about the ethics of dreams, which is very good for our course, because we're not going to be talking about Christian theology today. We're going to be talking about the ethics of dreams. Some might say that's more interesting, others might not. When we're going to look at the ethics of dreaming, we're going to start with the work of Augustine, because he really paved the way for asking ethical questions when it comes to what he did when he was dreaming. So Augustine was worried about the conduct of his actions within dreams. So he devoted his life to celibacy, and so he viewed any kind of sexual activity as immoral and was abstinent. He abstained from any kind of sexual activity. And he worried, though, when it came to the sexually explicit nature of his dreams. Now, I'm not sure he went into any kind of detail about the nature, what went on in his dreams, but it was enough to worry him about whether or not he was doing anything wrong by having these dreams. And in his work, The Confessions, he writes to God for answers. In Book 10, Chapter 30, he spoke to God about his lack of control over his dreams. And he says, firstly, he asked God, am I not myself during sleep? So he really asks questions about, the sort of nature of personhood. Do you become a different person when you're asleep? Which is a very interesting question. And then Augustine himself believed that he really was who he was in his dreams. So he asked God himself, am I the same person? And Augustine did believe that he was the same person, which put him at a moral dilemma. Because if he's the person in his dreams, then Augustine is the same person in reality as the person who's committing what he would regard as immoral acts, engaging in sexual activity in his dreams. And this was his solution. Augustine argued for there to be a distinction between what he called the happening and the action. So the happenings are the things that happen in your dreams, the things that happen to you, and the actions are the things that you have direct control over, i.e. in waking life. And so when he is dreaming, the things that happen to him are not his actions. So even though he is potentially doing immoral things, what he is doing is not immoral, because he has no kind of responsibility over the actions that he is committing. And so, because these things, because these things are happening to him, he has no control over these acts. When he's awake, however, he does have control over his actions. And so, when he's awake, he must conduct himself morally, and therefore be ethically liable for his actions in awake, and he cannot be ethically liable for his actions when he is asleep. And this is a little bit like the Kantian principle of ought implies can, which is the idea that if you ought to do something morally, like you ought to do X, there's an implication there that you actually must be able to do that thing. So, for example, I cannot be held morally responsible for not saving somebody from a burning building in the Middle East, for example, because there's no way I actually can go save this burning person from the UK. If that makes sense. So I don't hold any kind of moral responsibility for doing something, if I cannot actually be able to do it anyway. And this applies to Augustine. Augustine doesn't actually have any kind of control over the actions in his dreams, so he can't be held morally responsible. If he ought to do something, ought to act moral within his dreams, it must imply that he can actually have any control over his dreams, which he cannot. So, therefore, you cannot be morally liable for an action if you have no control whatsoever over it. And so, therefore, he removes any kind of notion of moral agency from dreaming. We cannot be responsible for what happens in our dreams, and that is his ethical theory. You might notice that this can also have the metaphysical implications, because in the last lesson we talked about ways in which you can distinguish between being in a dream and being awake. Well, Augustine seems to come up with his own solution, inadvertently come up with his own solution. So, if you remember from the last couple of lessons on the dream argument, Descartes has a lot of people arguing against his argument by suggesting that you can distinguish between being awake and being asleep, and they proposed a number of different methods for trying to work out a delineation between being awake and being asleep. You can't experience pain when you're in a dream. That's what Locke says. Dreams are absurd and reality is not. That's what Hobbes said. And Malcolm suggested this idea of a principle of coherency. Augustine also might have his argument here as well, because he could suggest that you can distinguish between being awake and being asleep, because when we are asleep we have no control over our actions. So that's just a little interesting metaphysical implication that comes out from Augustine's ethical problem. So in summary then, really the question is, what do you think about the ethics of dreaming and what Augustine says? Okay, is it enough to explain the ethics of dreaming? Can we suggest that this is valid enough to just abstain ourselves from any kind of moral responsibility? Or do we need more complicated ethics to work it out? Because in the next lesson we're going to look at some scenarios in which maybe our dreams, our moral agency within dreams should be questioned. And that is by looking at more detail in the ethics of dreaming, and then looking at two other modern theories, the consequentialist and the deontological theories, when it comes to dreaming.